Hey everybody, welcome back. This week I'm going to be talking to you about pronouns, sometimes preferred pronouns or preferred gender pronouns or PGPs. Whatever you call them, pronouns are the things we use to refer to people in the third person that aren't their names. They're also often used as the linguistic representation of people's gender identities. So, they're really important. Really, really, really important.
I want to suggest that there are also examples you will hear to object to this idea, which raise a false equivalency. This does not say anybody has the right to insist upon being called anything, because you can think of examples where that just won't do. So if I had a student in my classroom who said, "Professor, I would like you here from now on to please to refer to me as Your Majesty." Well, I'm not going to do that, I'm sorry, because objectively speaking, you are not royalty unless you can show me your crown. Right? So the question is not as broad as that. The question is actually very narrow and limited. It's limited to the question of the proper pronoun to be used for a person who is gender neutral, which brings me to point number 3. And that is the nature of gender. I want to distinguish between two related but different ideas. And those two ideas are gender and sex. Now, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just a lawyer. Emphasis on being the word just. But I'm going to suggest to you that the two ideas can be distinguished this way. Sex being the biological idea, and gender being the cultural idea. You might be able to determine somebody's sex by looking at objective factors. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But I'm going to entertain that possibility. I'm not sure you can do the same thing for gender, because gender is an inherently subjective thing. Unlike whether or not somebody qualifies for the title Your Majesty, I would have thought that whether or not you're a male or a female or a neither in gender terms is something only that you can tell us.
Well, your point about royalty and refusing to call somebody by your majesty unless they can show their crown is very similar to the detractors insisting upon gender identification and having to prove that they are the gender they are. Now, anybody can identify as anything, and they have the right to identify as whatever they want. The problem with not setting a limit on how you can identify is that you will get in, and I don't have the imagination to come up with other things. You know, you brought the example of royalty, but I'm sure somebody could say you have to refer to me as ship's captain. Well, maybe they can prove that they're a ship's captain. They have a rowboat and they're the captain of the ship.
And so finally, let's talk about language, because this, after all, is about language. We may, in fact, be talking about a peculiar characteristic of the English language. Because as of right now, the English language has just 2 personal pronouns that can be used for human beings. We have a third one, it's called it. But this doesn't fit very well when you're trying to talk about a human being. The English language is not unique in this, but nor is it universal. There are other languages that do have either a neutral third choice or are not gendered in the first place. One might be inclined to resolve this debate by looking to the dictionary and saying, well, I'm sorry, there's only 2 in there. There is no third. The third that you want me to use I can't find, and therefore it's not part of the language, and therefore I'm not going to do that. But the thing about language, both English and all the others, is that it is essentially evolutionary. It changes over time. And if you look in the dictionary today and don't find that third thing, Look again. In a year, in 2 years, in 5 years, it will be there. So the fact of its absence at the moment is really not determinative of anything. It's coming. We might as well be ahead of the curve than behind.
Professor Peterson will be addressing this idea of multiple adding genders, adding more and more genders every year to the dictionary. Because as I mentioned, in addition to genders, there is identifications, and what are the identifications that people can come up with that you can say are not valid? You mentioned, as I responded to already, you mentioned royalty. You have to prove to show your crown, but there's a lot of titles that people can come up with. They can actually prove, or maybe they just feel that way. And who are you to decide when we get into this realm of being forced to identify people as they want to be? Who are you to decide what they can and can't be identified with? But anyway, Professor Peterson is going to be addressing in his part of his follow-up to your start, this issue of a multitude of genders.
So let's get to the insist upon by force issue here, because that's really the issue. And that's the way that this should be formulated. And so, well, we could also, there's another problem here too, and the problem is, well, which pronouns exactly? And you might say, well, a transsexual male to female has the right to be addressed as she, and the reverse as he, and in fact most transsexuals, in fact the overwhelming majority of them, they're about maybe 0.3% of the population to begin with, and I would estimate, although I don't know for sure, that it's 99% of them, but no one really knows, actually want to be addressed by he or she. They just want to be addressed by the other one. Okay, so there's a tiny minority, the size of which no one knows, who insists that that particular categorization scheme doesn't apply to them. So the question then is, which one does? And the problem with that is that you cannot actually answer that question. And I can give you a hint about that with regards to the ever-lengthening acronym used by the LGBT community to describe those who are marginalized. You may notice that every year there's an additional initial in that acronym, and the reason for that is that the potential number of identities will multiply until it fractionates down to the level of the individual itself. It has to, because you're not a group, you're not a member of a group, you're the simultaneous member of multiple groups. In fact, so many groups that they can't even be enumerated. And if my linguistic usage is predicated on recognizing all of those identities, well, we might as well just go home now, because I don't have time to come up with the million different descriptive pronouns that are properly going to more or less evolve the free market. Because one of the things the free market does is enable you to recognize your multi-dimensional existence, say, and mine simultaneously, using mutually agreed upon price as the determinant that takes all of those factors simultaneously into account. And actually, on a pure computational level, there isn't any other solution to that problem, because it's actually incomputable. So the pronoun problem becomes very, very problematic, very, very rapidly. You can see that with the acronym growth in the LGBT community, which has to fractionate, will continue to fractionate, because none of those groups are homogeneous in any but the most trivial of senses. So that's a big problem. Which pronouns? Okay, so what sort of problem is that? Well, in New York State, for example, they've already more or less passed into law the proposition that there are pretty much as many pronoun descriptors as there are people claiming identities. And so on Facebook, for example, which is a good example of, say, common parlance, there's about 71 different gender identities already recognized, and no agreed upon lexicon to represent any of them. And so the issue there is, well, what stops the infinite multiplication? And the answer to that is whim. And that's actually written into the law, because the law already states that your identity is predicated on your subjective, and I would say whim, and that's also wrong.
The issue is easily resolved rather than forcing people to comply with a never-ending growing list of personal pronouns and genders. as Professor Peterson mentioned, it could get into the millions, into a unique situation where there are 7 billion different pronouns, one for each person. The solution is something we've already been doing for generations, and we all have names. And names are not a social construct. There are names. That's how we identify ourselves. Everybody identifies with a name. I'm sure there's a very small amount of people that are not mentally all there that pick a number or something instead of a name. But there you have it. So we have names. And here's another thing that we've been doing for generations is nicknames. So if you are John Smith, you want to be Jack Smith or JJ Smith or J Smith. J Smith initial or JJ Smith is gender neutral, and the last name is gender neutral. It's a solution to. I think I would say that in a professional environment, if you can't identify a student, say in the classroom, by their name, it's possible we've got a problem. So rather than enforcing this endless, ever-growing list, could be ever-growing list of and constantly changing genders, where you can decide, there are people that can decide day by day which gender they are, and making it difficult and against the law for a professor to use, we already have names, and we're allowed to make up nicknames for ourselves, and that is constructed. And it's accepted. I don't think there's ever been a problem if you're, like I said, if you're John, Jack, Jay, and the same with female names. So Karen can be K, right? And there's a lot of nicknames. You have your own. Some people call themselves Spanky or Shorty or Stretch. And they're referred to that by their friends, by their colleagues. It's an answer. So anyway, thank you, Jordan Peterson, for fighting the good fight. That's all I have to say on the matter. I wanted to point out this when I saw Jordan Peterson talking about this multitude and endless pronouns. That's when I was thinking this could really get out of hand. You say it won't, but if you listen to the lawyer who talked earlier, well, we can count on it that the dictionary is going to grow year by year. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy this channel, please subscribe. Please press like. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Your identity is like your reputation. You think you get to have the reputation you want? Well, good luck with that one.